I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kid Straight Mom. Today, we are going to talk about why LGBTQ plus rights matter, why they're important. It seems like there's a tendency to look at LGBTQ plus issues as fringe issues. I regularly hear things like, I don't care if they're gay, why do they have to be in our face about it? Many people see this advocacy work as unnecessarily polarizing, that, we're not homophobic, there are bigger problems. Our take on this is that LGBTQ plus rights are a reading on our society. Are we compassionate, well-read, supportive of humans and all forms? But it's actually more than that. If you are just worried about the problems that actually matter, the ripple effects of alienating and dehumanizing LGBTQ plus people touch virtually all of the problems that people across the political spectrum acknowledge need to be addressed. When people say, why are we talking about gay and trans people when we have bigger problems? They're ignoring how those problems are actually affected by marginalizing LGBTQ plus people. I picked 3 of those issues that are big talking points when you ask people what they're concerned about: homelessness, drug addiction, and trafficking. So, what does this have to do with homelessness? According to the Trevor Project, as of 2022, 28% of LGBTQ plus youth reported experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity at some point. 16% reported that they had slept away from parents or caregivers because they ran away from home. And more than half reported that they ran away from home because of mistreatment or fear of mistreatment due to their LGBTQ identity. 14% of LGBTQ plus youth reported that they had slept away from parents or caregivers because they were kicked out or abandoned, with 40% reporting that they were kicked out or abandoned due to their LGBTQ plus identity. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, LGBTQ plus youth are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBTQ plus youth. They're highly overrepresented in the homeless population. Research shows that they're 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than their straight peers. They account for up to 40% of homeless people in North America, which is a staggeringly high statistic given that only roughly 5% of the general youth population identifies as LGBTQ+. As a young LGBTQ plus person yourself, did you have friends that this was an issue for? People you knew in high school?
Yeah, to an extent. And that the cases that I can think of most off the top of my head were people that I wasn't really close to anymore at that point. And so I don't, know the details of what was going on. But yeah, it was for sure like there were people who ended up leaving their homes because they didn't feel comfortable or safe. And I think also it's always front of mind for queer people. Like, what do I do if my family or caregivers turn out to be unsupportive? What's my escape plan? What's my emergency plan? What are my resources? I think it's something that people are really aware of.
Yeah. Well, and then even as far as the resources go, what research shows is that it's hard to find support services. Even when you leave home, LGBTQ plus people are often harassed in shelters by peers or even staff, and they don't always feel comfortable or safe seeking help. And some transgender people are turned away from shelters because of their gender identity or are subjected to abuse when they're forced to stay with members of the sex they were assigned at birth. This is especially true for transgender women.
Well, and unfortunately, a lot of the resources that currently exist just aren't necessarily targeted towards sort of emergency interventions in terms of, just giving your people a place to sleep for the night. Like, for instance, at Pride House, as much as we would love to be able to do that, that's just like not something that our insurance, our mission, our resources allows for. It's, largely true for most queer organizations.
Yeah, it becomes much more complicated, if nothing else, because of legal issues. It's incredibly important that anywhere where kids are staying, young people are staying, has to be safe. Everybody working there has to be really well vetted. Like those are of utmost importance. So, there's nervousness from organizations about taking that responsibility on. And unfortunately, there is also the knowledge that you will be a target because of this whole narrative that, it's more likely that there will be LGBTQ plus people staffing a place that is supportive of LGBTQ plus youth. And that's a population that's just always going to be at more risk of assumptions that they're somehow out to victimize young people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this issue of homelessness is directly tied in many ways to the attitudes that a lot of people in our society have towards LGBTQ plus young people. According to the United Way, prejudice, stigma, and homophobia can lead LGBTQ plus youth to experience housing instability or homelessness. And of course, seems obvious, but this is especially true if their family, friends, and communities do not accept their gender identity or sexuality. Such a simple thing, accepting your kids for who they are and being supportive and affirming, but it's not happening enough. And this is sadly a side effect of that. So another issue that's legitimate, that's truly a problem, is drug addiction, substance abuse. This is another one that there are direct ties to the LGBTQ plus experience. Research has shown that gay, lesbian, and bisexual high school students use substances at significantly higher levels than their straight peers. There hasn't been a lot of research on trans and non-binary youth at this point. Interestingly, experiencing conversion therapy or efforts to change a youth's LGBTQ plus identity to straight and or cisgender was associated with greater odds of reporting regular alcohol use, regular marijuana use, and prescription drug misuse.
Gee, shocker.
Further, experiencing physical harm due to one's LGBTQ plus identity was associated with greater odds of reporting regular alcohol use, regular marijuana use, or nearly 2 times greater odds of regular prescription drug misuse. It turns out that if you feel horrible about who you are based on the attitudes of the people around you, you're more likely to abuse substances.
What a concept.
I think there is this desire to steal the narrative from some people when we try to show concerns over, things like suicide rates, substance abuse, anything like that. As soon as you say, these kids, these LGBTQ plus young people have higher rates of these things, and you get this whole segment of people chiming in with, see, these kids are disturbed. They're mentally ill. We shouldn't be encouraging them. We should be helping them. Helping usually meaning telling them not to be who they are. This is an audience I probably don't have to explain this to, but it is not being LGBTQ plus youth that creates higher suicide rates, higher drug addiction rates. In and of itself, it is society's attitudes toward these young people that lead to these other issues. It's that feeling of not belonging.
Yeah, I mean, it's true for any marginalized group, right? Like you see similar problems in people of color and religious minorities sometimes and disabled people. And it's not because they're bad people or there's something inherently wrong with them. It's because we treat them badly.
Yes. To that point, according to a 2010 study in the American Journal of Public Health, nearly half of adults who reported discrimination on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation in their lifetimes met the criteria for past year substance use disorders, compared with less than 1 in 5 of those who reported no discrimination. Even if you are one of these identities, it is not the identity, it is the discrimination. Of particular note is that LGB adults who reported none of the 3 types of discrimination that this study looked at in their lifetime had rates of past year substance use disorders that were similar to those of heterosexual adults. So general population numbers, unless you've experienced discrimination. Another issue that exacerbates this problem in this community is that, according to the Journal of Substance Abuse Treatment, Prevention and Policy, LGBTQ plus patients in substance abuse treatment programs often experience bullying, name-calling, sexual harassment, and physical distancing from peers. Obviously, if you go into a substance abuse program and you face abuse, you are more likely to relapse because your support system is not a refuge and it's not going to help you. So, substance abuse, drug abuse, if you're worried about this, there are things we can do. Trafficking. This, for some reason, I don't really understand, became like such a buzz topic in conservative circles over the past few years.
I can tell you why. It's because they can pretend to care about marginalized people while turning people of color and queer people into their scapegoats.
Makes sense. So, on that note, I just happened to see there's an article in the New York Times this morning that I will put on the website about Tim Ballard, who started the nonprofit Operation Underground Railroad and had this movie, Sound of Freedom, that was a huge hit last year. Conservatives loved this movie. The tagline was, "God's children are not for sale." Tim Ballard is under a lot of scrutiny right now because women that have worked for him have come forward and accused him of sexual abuse. Basically, what this guy was doing, this is a little bit of a tangent. To me, it just says so much about this movement. Did I mention that Donald Trump held a screening of this movie?
You didn't mention it, but that is unsurprising.
So what this guy was doing was undercover operations where he would go to poor countries, pose as somebody who was a perpetrator, offer to pay local people to bring underage girls in the interest of reporting them to law enforcement, to catching them. He would recruit women to pose as his wife, as a couple that was into, I don't know, the word sex tourism or something was in there, as the excuse that we're here as a couple. That's why we're not engaging in some of these acts. But the allegations are that he ended up abusing these women by forcing them into uncomfortable sexual situations, by telling them they had to make it convincing. Somebody could be watching at all times. So they basically had to do whatever he wanted to do because somebody might be watching and they had to make it convincing that they were a couple. The whole thing is icky to me. I don't know what they will find about him in the end, but it reads a little when you always see the pastors that rail on about transgender people and gay people being predators and then they end up being sexual predators. Kind of like that. So anyway, trafficking, big buzzword. Everybody loves to support rescuing kids from sexual predators, as they should. Oh, and one other thing I had to throw in there about Operation Underground Railroad is experts have weighed in and said, well, yeah, if you go to a country where people have no money and offer somebody a bunch of money to bring you underage girls, they're going to do it. You might be creating a market for something that maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah, it's very exploitative. And like I said, villainizing people of color because that's unfortunately where all these countries are, and creating this narrative that oh, these are terrible people who want to sell their children.
Yeah, you're going to desperate people and saying, hey, I'll give you money to do this. Yeah, just weird. But if this is legitimately an issue that you are concerned about and would like to fix, guess what? According to the National Center for Youth Law, youth who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, and all sexual and gender minorities are among those most vulnerable to sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. In a 2016 study of 949 youth involved in the sex trade in 6 cities across the U.S., nearly half were LGBTQ. This by youth, they're saying ages 13 to 24. A study from 2014 to 2016 with 641 homeless youth across 10 cities in the US and Canada found that 24% of LGBTQ youth were trafficked for sex, compared with 12% of non-LGBTQ youth. While LGBTQ youth comprised only 19% of respondents, they comprised 36% of those who were sex trafficked and 36% of those involved in the sex trade. A 2018 study with 270 homeless youth in Philadelphia, Phoenix, and Washington, D.C. found that although LGBTQ youth comprised only 15% of the youth interviewed, they comprised 39% of those who reported being sex trafficked. 60% of transgender youth reported experiencing sex trafficking. Because these numbers are insane. This is a really vulnerable population that is being wildly exploited. The National Center for Youth Law has a really nice graphic showing how systemic oppression leads to human trafficking and negative health outcomes. And, it really kind of shows you how that pattern develops. One study of homeless youth in New York City found LGBTQ plus youth were 7 to 8 times more likely to have traded sex to meet basic needs than their non-LGBTQ peers. So when you are rejected by your family and your society and become desperate, these kids end up in the situations that people want to solve, but then continue the narrative that is destructive to these kids. A 2017 survey of over 12,000 youth aged 13 to 17 across the U.S. found that 48% of LGBTQ plus youth who were out to their parents say that their families make them feel bad for being LGBTQ. And 67% of LGBTQ youth hear their families make negative comments about LGBTQ people. The majority of LGBTQ plus youth experience negative and hostile school environments. Only 26% reported that they always feel safe in the classroom. 73% have experienced verbal threats because of their actual or perceived LGBTQ identity, while 70% have been bullied at school because of their sexual orientation. This leads to isolation. Isolation leads to every one of these problems: homelessness, drug use, trafficking. This is a simple cause and effect. What can we do to solve some of these societal problems? What do you think?
Wow, there are so many options. So first of all, we could stop this backsliding thing where we're actively trying to make schools less accepting and more hostile towards queer kids. That would be a good starting place. Anti-discrimination laws that will help ensure that queer people aren't losing their housing. And it's the whole point of this episode, right, is that everything's connected. And we've talked about it in many, many different circumstances, but also just addressing a lot of the other social problems that we have going on, will help free up the capacity to address and learn about problems, right? It's not necessarily surprising that if a family is living meal to meal, that they aren't going to be putting a ton of effort into how can I best support my queer child, which isn't, a good thing, but it's not surprising either, right? It's understandable. And so if we address poverty and its systemic causes, that would also be very helpful. There are so many things. There are so many things.
Many things. According to my research, here are some more formal versions probably of what Sienna just said. Strong anti-discrimination policies in the workplace and strong anti-bully and harassment policies in schools. These things keep LGBTQ plus youth connected to school and employment. That increases their skills and future earnings and makes it so they can maintain stable housing, creating inclusive communities and services. We need programs that are intentionally created to be overtly inclusive of at-risk populations, such as LGBTQ plus people, to combat systemic injustices. These safe places should be guided by the expertise of people with lived experiences. Education. Misinformation damages any social justice movement. And there are so many myths and falsehoods out there about LGBTQ plus people. You see them all the time, things that people truly believe. And that misinformation leads to problems even throughout the places that are meant to help: substance abuse treatments, foster parents, across the board. So learn the facts and spread those, not the fake stuff.
And also listen to people who have actual experience with the things that you're talking about.
Yes, that's a big one. There's such a attitude of, look, you have rights now, quit whining.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also that, when you have people who make these kind of convenient victims, especially when some people might not be operating in the greatest of good faith, that you can be like, look at these poor trafficked children, allow me to speak for them. And like, no, there are plenty of adults out there who experienced sex trafficking and they can speak for themselves, and we should be centering their voices, not like the voices of creepy men who hire women to go pretend to be their wives and get people to sell their children to them.
That's a good point. That's fair. Advocate for justice. We should, like you just said, listen to the people that have been there, follow the leadership of survivors, and figure out ways to make a more inclusive culture across the board. We should be supporting policies that impact LGBTQ plus community and legislation that dedicates funding to more inclusive services. Substance abuse programs that promote affirming care, non-discrimination policies, staff training. Covenant House on their website has the line, LGBTQ plus young people need adults in their lives to keep them safe, housed, and not just accepted, but celebrated for who they are.
And, we talked about this in an episode a couple months ago, a very specific example with like mentorship programs. And, that's like a really good example, right? If you have a mentorship program that's designed to support at-risk youth, but it doesn't train the mentors to support some of our most at-risk youth, then it's not really doing its job. And I mean, that's, as we covered, lack of a supportive adult in a queer kid's life is sort of one of the easiest ways for them to get sucked into these harmful experiences. Because if you have no one who gives you support and affection and care and love in your life, it's really easy to interpret predatory behavior from other people, whether you meet them, on the streets or the internet or wherever. It's easy to misinterpret that as the love and affection that you've been looking for, which is sad.
Is sad. And I think it's really easy to blame the victims and say, well, that's a choice you made. And yeah, like you said, I mean, sometimes it's just desperate to meet basic needs. And sometimes it's desperation to feel wanted or cared about or important to somebody, even if you're only important to them because you are gratifying some need or making them money.
Which is, of course, a form of basic need, right? Like we are social beings and we require meaningful relationships. And if we are not provided with those, then we're going to seek them out. And if you're a kid who doesn't have experience or resources or judgment to understand, and who's never been given a model, then of course you might end up getting into really dangerous situations because, again, trying to fulfill a basic need.
Yep. So what we can do is obvious, be as, just members of society, is to be more accepting. Professionals, the National Center for Youth Law gives this overview of recommendations: recognize and address biases, require training and education, engage and partner with people with lived experience, improve identification and screening, build services and spaces for LGBTQ plus youth, create safe and affirming homes and placemats for LGBTQ plus youth, ensure representation and inclusivity in language, materials, and staffing, provide access to gender-affirming healthcare, and invest in more research. So yes, it matters. This is not a matter of we want it to be all about us from LGBTQ people. This is our society. And caring for people means caring for all people. Sometimes that means doing things for the betterment of people that you don't like or don't agree with or don't approve of, because it is part of being a responsible member of society. You don't always get to choose the people who benefit from your goodwill.
Right, because if you choose the people who benefit from your goodwill, that's just charity. That's not justice.
Yes. And the whole virtue requirement for people to receive help that you see, the people that don't want to pay higher taxes, but they say, I donate money to charity. And it's because they get to choose who's receiving their help. They don't want it to just go to single mothers who in their mind shouldn't have gotten themselves into that situation. Going back to I remember reading about Andrew Carnegie. It's awesome that we have these amazing libraries, right? This investment in wonderful things for our communities. He also didn't pay his workers particularly well.
Yeah, I mean, look at today's billionaires, right? Like, oh, well, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does so much good work. Great, but imagine how much we could do if we got a couple of those $1 billion.
Yeah. The spending on what you think people should have instead of what is just going to help pull people up and make things better for everybody. Anyway, also a little bit of a tangent. This is one of those episodes where I completely geeked out and threw a whole bunch of numbers at you guys, but I hope that like throughout that you latch onto the important parts and yeah, tell people when they say, why do we have to care about this? I'm worried about drug abuse. Well, let me tell you why.
And if you have other issues that you hear people saying are important, throw them at us. I bet we'll be able to connect them.
Yes, it'll be a new project. Connect the societal ill to LGBTQ plus discrimination. There's probably a lot of material out there. For our next episode, even though it's only September, if you're anything like us, you want to go into October with a list of spooky season movies to watch. So we're going to go ahead in anticipation of that and do another episode about queer representation and issues and metaphors and all of that good stuff in horror movies. So we'll talk about a few movies and how they are important in that way that horror and queerness have always been sort of intertwined in the media. So we're looking forward to that. We always enjoy watching some movies and reviewing them for you. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
If you found this podcast helpful, interesting, or just mildly amusing, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps us to get the word out there and spread this information as far as we can.
And as always, check out our website at queerkidsstraightmom.com or visit us on Facebook, Queer Kid Straight Mom, Instagram at queerkid.straightmom, or Twitter at queerkidstr8mom.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.